Hi guys. Hello. I hope the audio is coming fine. Let me know if it isn't. Hi guys. I hope the audio is coming fine. Let me know if it isn't. Thank you for joining the live stream in the middle of an afternoon basically, or just in the evening. And I didn't announce it much earlier because as usual my schedule is all screwed up because I randomly get music projects. So I couldn't come live unfortunately for so many days, about I think 1 week entirely. It was very sad and tough for me as well because I missed reading so much and missed discussing all these fantastic papers that I have piled up basically in my folders, and I couldn't discuss them for so many days. I have 2 papers due written by Nicholas Dirks, 2 papers by this woman, Dr. Janaki Bakhle, and so one of them we are going to discuss today. Then there's, I think, 2 more fantastic papers that are in line waiting. And a recent background score project has come up for a comedy web series on MX Player. So tight schedule, 10 दिन में 8 episode का पूरा season complete करना है. So that's why my timeline is getting very very screwed, and I hope I'm able to do this from tomorrow onwards again, frequently and consistently. So as you all know from my community post that I have recently ordered a book by this scholar, this history professor, Dr. Janaki Bakhle, because she is one of those scholars who is respected in academia. For example, you can see this paper is from published by Duke University Press. Okay, so the fun part about these papers and these authors is that these people can always be cited by people who are doing research and be taken seriously in academia, in academic circles. So even if someone is a bit right-leaning, okay, they can use these people as citations. People can't really cite J. Sai Deepak or Vikram Sampath in social science because their profession, their bio, everything comes as an obstacle. Because if you are, let's say today a young person is pursuing sociology and while discussing decoloniality, she cites J. Sai Deepak, her paper will be thrown out of the class because she's quoting a random lawyer from a random country. Why? How is that relevant? Okay. Now you can't get into the nitty-gritty and details that no, actually you see J. Sai Deepak has done research from legit scholars, so you can't really throw it out outright. But you see there's some tradism going on in academia as well. Would you like it if someone without a Janeu was going around doing puja part or giving lectures on Rigved, okay? And who is not really a legit source. That person actually might be a legit source. We don't know if it is. Okay, the Janeu is supposed to be some basic at least demarcation that this person knows something. And people who are roaming about with Janeus but they don't know these things, they are a different matter. But so PhDs and being from that department are the Janeus of the academia. So I'm interested in this author because she does not come across at all, based on the basic readings I have done from her, some excerpts from her book, some excerpts from her papers, some interviews, some articles, her review of Vikram Sampath's book, etc. She comes across as a person who is not overtly dismissive of Veer Savarkar. Neither does she think that Veer Savarkar is that the most evil thing to have happened in Indian history, the most evil thing to have happened in the history of humanity after Hitler. Okay. A direct murderer, indirect murderer of Mahatma Gandhi is the face of Hindu fascism. Okay. She's not like that. That's why I'm interested and curious about what I'm going to find out from her papers. And let's see. This is the first time I'm going to read something written by her in its entirety. And then when the book comes out, I'll be more interested, and it will be fun to find out. Because if she is not dismissing him, Savarkar, outright and not calling him a Hindutva fascist, then what are her criticisms of Savarkar? Because she is a declared Gandhian. That much is guaranteed, okay? That much she has said herself, basically. No, not said herself, you can make out. But then what exactly can be her criticisms of Savarkar? And I think she has been appreciative of Savarkar's stance on casteism as well. So that's going to be a pretty balanced approach, and if something good can come out of such a paper, it's good for people on the kind of the non-left side of social sciences. They can cite these people in their research work. Gami is yet to release. Chobita Shada Kalo Kano. Gami movie, it is interesting. Shada Kalo, I'm just experimenting. Okay, let's start this paper. So, this is from 2010, okay. I have another paper by her that's also from 2010, which we will discuss in some other upcoming live stream. And then we have to discuss the entire Sitaram Goel book, Hindu temples and what happened to them as well. So, बहुत due हो गया है, 7 दिन मैं नहीं आ पाया. So, both of these papers are from 2010. So, let's see what this says. Country First, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, 1883 to 1966, and the writings of essentials of Hindutva, Janaki Bakhle. She teaches history at University of California, Los Angeles, and her husband is the famous Nicholas B. Dirks, who has dismantled a lot of caste myths. In March 1922, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the leader of the first Indian non-violent non-cooperation movement against British rule, did something that stunned his fellow nationalists. A group of angry villagers in Chaudi Chauda had set fire to a police station, killing 19 policemen. Outraged by this violence, Gandhi called off the movement. This confounded his supporters because the British government was under extreme pressure from the India-wide protests. Many jailed non-cooperators heard the news and were incredulous that a single act of violence made Gandhi call off the movement when... what is this? A citation. When success seemed within reach. But the Mahatma was resolute. Is that a compliment? India was not ready for independence, he argued. If India's inhabitants resorted to violence even in a good cause, even then India is not ready for independence. Paradoxically, this quixotic, if high-minded decision renewed the colonial regime's lease to rule precisely at the point when foreclosure seemed imminent. It instead ended up tightening colonial rule. The colonial government had Gandhi to thank for its continued rule and rewarded him by arresting him. Okay, let's see what the footnote says, okay? There was a gigantic footnote. I am grateful to Arjun Appadurai. Okay, this is acknowledgements. The argument I make, however, is mine alone and I am solely responsible for its flaws. A note on diacritical remarks. Okay, ये जान के हमारा कोई काम तो है नहीं. काम है क्या? Okay, a note on diacritical marks. Essentials of Hindutva was written in English. None of the Marathi or Sanskrit words were diacritically marked, and in quoting passages from the work, I have left the text unmarked. To keep the text consistent, I have added no diacritical marks and or accents to any words in Hindi, Sanskrit or Marathi, since most of the words and names are familiar to scholars of South Asia. Okay, ठीक है. Let's continue. हाँ, नाम तो जानकी है. So, just when India was about to get independence, Gandhi screws it up, colonial rule tightens up, and instead they arrest Gandhi. Just a few months earlier in 1921, a revolutionary nationalist who had been tried and convicted for gun running and abetting murder, among other offences, was brought back to mainland India from incarceration on Andaman Islands and placed in an Indian jail. His name was Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. Gandhi had met him in 1909 and had subsequently described him as brave, clever and a patriot. Savarkar, who was 38 years old, had spent a decade in jail. 10 years in jail. He had devoted his life to the pursuit of Indian independence from colonial rule and had fashioned himself as a revolutionary even as a very young man. He was born into a poor middle-class Brahmin family. Poor middling Brahmin family. I don't know what middling means in this context. Middling Brahmin family in the small village of Bhagur near Nasik on May 27, 1883. The chief revolutionary in the family was Savarkar's older brother, Baba Rao, and because of him, the entire family was under surveillance. So was Baba Rao the brother who got beaten to death basically because Godse was a Chitpavin Brahmin who murdered Gandhi, and therefore when the genocide of Chitpavin Brahmins happened, elder brother of Savarkar was beaten to death, I know, but how many elder brothers did he have? I don't know that. And because of him, the entire family was under surveillance. In 1899, Savarkar and a couple of his friends founded a secret revolutionary association called Rashtrabhakta Samuha, Patriot Society, which in 1901 would become the Mitra Mela, Friend Society. In 1902, Savarkar joined Ferguson College in Pune, where he organized protests against the colonial government. एक बार दाएं तरफ एक बार बाएं तरफ. Like many other young educated Indian men, he went to London to study law in 1906, but he spent most of his time engaged in political activities, some benign and some not so benign, such as smuggling Browning pistols into India for political assassinations. क्या दिन थे भाई वो. In 1910, Savarkar was arrested in London and charged with 5 serious offences, including conspiracy against the king's government and abetting murder. Extradited to India for trial, he was subsequently convicted and taken in 1911 to serve 2 life terms on the Andaman Islands. One of the lesser charges that had landed him in jail was sedition. Okay, ये जो बंगाली कॉमीज लोग और बहुत नॉन बंगाली कॉमीज भी बोलते रहते हैं कि वो अपोलोजाइज काहे किया मुचलेका दिया था. तो भाई 10 साल रह लिया है वो. 10 साल पहले ही अगर पहले दिन में अपोलोजाइज कर लेता तब कोई एक्सक्यूज बनता क्रिटिसाइज करने का. One of the lesser charges that had landed him in jail was sedition. Nevertheless, shortly after his repatriation to an Indian prison in 1921, he wrote another potentially seditious work. But this book was different from his previous works. It was written in English, not in Marathi, his mother tongue. So, now he was even bolder now कि इंग्लिश में ही लिखूंगा मैं जो देखता हूँ क्या करता है. तू पर इंग्लिश में फिर भी I don't give a shit basically. The book was titled Essentials of Hindutva. Hindutva is one of the few texts written by an Indian nationalist that links the present Hindu movement of Indian history to the pre-independence anti-colonial period. Not even Gandhi's own texts from 1920s, much as they are read by academics, can claim such a time span of influence. However, Hindutva's influence has not been without controversy. 5 decades after it was written, it became the Bible of militant and exclusionary Hindu nationalism, taking as its chief enemy the minority Muslim community of India. It was so exclusionary that the draft constitution of the Hindu Mahasabha gave equal rights to people of all religions, castes, creeds, sex, gender, etc. And in fact had a nice gun right as well. The book would also come to encapsulate and exemplify Savarkar's entire oeuvre of writing and would dramatically influence the course of modern Indian history. Why did this text, not easy to characterize, let alone subject to sustained analysis, become so important in its own time and even now? When Savarkar had been taken away from India in 1911, the British colonial government seemed reasonably in control. Gandhi was nowhere on the Indian scene, and even if he was known to Indian nationalists as a political leader in South Africa. By the time Savarkar was repatriated in an Indian jail in 1921, he had spent nearly 15 years away from India between his years in London as a student and a decade in prison on the Andaman Islands. 10 saal jail mein. On his repatriation and re-imprisonment in an Indian jail, he would have to contend with Gandhi, who had not only come back to India for good but also assumed control of the nationalist movement. In 1919, तो तब से ही हमारा एक वो मतलब फॉरेन रिटर्न का कोई एक मतलब अलग रेस्पेक्ट से देखने का टेंडेंसी है तब से ही. तो यहाँ के इतने सारे रेवोल्यूशनरीज थे उनसे नहीं होगा. साउथ अफ्रीका से कौन लौटा है वो असली माल है. In 1919, Gandhi had launched an all-Indian non-violent non-cooperation movement against colonial rule. For someone who had spent a decade in jail for revolutionary activities, the news that the anti-colonial struggle had resumed under the banner of non-violent non-cooperation must have seemed unpalatable. Non-cooperation in any event had not begun well. The first phase had sputtered out quickly, and Gandhi had restarted it in 1920. But however incomprehensible non-cooperation may have seemed to Savarkar, Gandhi would baffle him even more by adding yet another element to his movement in its second phase. What Gandhi had done was to yoke non-cooperation to another cause called the Khilafat movement. And here, this is one great thing that we can say as a compliment for the scholar Dr. Janaki Bakhle, that she is an honest scholar, because in 2010, at least, maybe it was common in academic circles anyway, that Khilafat ब्रैकेट में Caliphate movement बोल दिया इन्होंने, जो कि आजकल के दिनों में हिंदुत्ववादी यूट्यूबर्स बोलते फिरते हैं, जिससे हम लोगों को सबसे पहले पता चला, people who are 30 and under, we never knew that Khilafat was the Caliphate movement. We thought Khilafat was meaning colonial rule के खिलाफ है ना. तो at least she's making that clear here. She's not hiding any facts. Sunni Muslim leaders of the movement had made 3 demands of the British colonial government. They had insisted that their demands were religious rather than political and asked for the maintenance of the sovereignty of the Turkish Sultan as the Caliph or spiritual leader of Islam. In addition, they protested the possible dismemberment, meaning tukre tukre hona, of the territories of the Ottoman empires into into mandates, and the internationalization of Constantinople as further assaults on Islam. The Khilafat issue, as Gail Minot argues, was voiced in the language of religion, but provided symbolic cover for both nationalist and internationalist Muslims. Interesting criticism, huh? This may or may not be looked at as a criticism, depends on who you are asking, but this is a very significant line. I think we, on this side, we will basically look at it as a criticism that Gail Minot is saying the language of the Khilafat movement was voiced in, it was language of religion only, but it was a symbolic cover for both nationalist and internationalist Muslims, who for both India-specific and pan-Islamist Islamicist reasons oppose the British, for mainly their religion, not for anything else. For Gandhi, however, the specifically religious language of the Khilafat movement provided a different alibi. Since none of the issues was directly connected to the nationalist movement in India, he embraced the Khilafat movement primarily to unite a vast population of Indian Muslims divided by regional, linguistic, class and sectarian differences behind his own movement. ओके यहाँ पे फुटनोट में कुछ है फॉर ओके ये बुक रिकमेंडेशंस है इंटरेस्टिंग ठीक है The Khilafat movement was ultimately unsuccessful. Not only did its demands fall on deaf British ears, but Kemal Pasha Ataturk himself abolished the Khilafat. However, Gandhi was determined to recruit Muslims in India to the nationalist movement by demonstrating symbolic support for an Islamic cause, even if that cause was doomed to fail. He had taken on on other symbolic causes in South Africa, for example, when he advocated the end of apartheid laws. In both cases, he was a master of symbolic politics in the service of the politics that most mattered to him. And I have heard from many scholars and some basically scholars who have become kind of YouTubers or YouTubers who are podcasters who have brought on scholars, etc., that Gandhi was not, in fact, really championing the end of racism in South Africa. He was very angry that why were Indians being treated the same as black Africans. Whether or not he cared about the outcome or expected it to be influenced by Indian agitations, he made the Khilafat movement central to the second phase of non-cooperation and Indian nationalism. The Khilafatists argued that since they were also anti-British, Khilafat concerns and Indian nationalism. The Khilafatists argued that since they were also anti-British, Khilafat concerns and Indian nationalism were compatible. Mainstream nationalists, however, had to accept that Muslims as a community had the right to demand dual, if not triple allegiance. The first was a spiritual and religious allegiance, not dissimilar to that held by believing Catholics and Jews in India. The second was a political allegiance to the cause of Indian independence from British rule. Third would have been a modern allegiance to Islam that was not religious or spiritual but Muslim and nationalist. How is the first and third different? I don't understand. Especially if she's saying that the first part about having some sort of allegiance to a holy land is similar to Catholics and Jews having some sort of allegiance to Christian and Jewish holy lands, then how is the third one different from the first one? Even though the third allegiance would have had much in common with Savarkar's own conceptualization of Hindutva, it would have been highly disturbing. But given that Gandhi saw no harm in linking Muslim sentiment over the Khilafat movement, whether he took it as primarily religious or political, he was willing to use the cause to recruit substantial minority support for his platform. Many nationalists, Hindu and Muslim, were disturbed not only by the linkage of religion and politics, but also by the particular form of Muslim politics represented by Khilafat in the context of a nationalist movement. तो आज जो लोग बोलते हैं कि पॉलिटिक्स को मिक्स मत करो रिलीजन के साथ, उनके मुंह पे ये मेन स्ट्रीम एकेडमिक का पेपर जाके मारो. Savarkar was one such nationalist. He was not always consistent in his conviction that religion and politics had to be divorced, but he was a secular thinker who held territorial sovereignty to be absolute. The linkage of Indian nationalism to a transnational religious cause would have seemed deeply troubling. In theory, he had nothing against Hindu-Muslim unity. having written about it romantically as the mainstay of the 1857 rebellion against the East India Company, which we discussed a bit. But Gandhi had in effect called Savarkar's bluff on the subject. Okay, now she is being harshly critical of Savarkar. Interesting. But not remotely as harshly as other mainstream scholars. So, apparently Gandhi had called Savarkar's secular bluff on the subject of Hindu-Muslim unity by supporting the Khilafat movement. How would he react? What shape would his reaction take? Let's see. Let me check some comments now. I think she is going to come to the conclusion that Hindutva and Islamism is the same. Vinay Singh is saying, I am of the opinion that everyone, irrespective of caste, race, jati, varna, gender bias and nationality, should be allowed to enter temple, but must respect the ritual of that temple. Yes, I agree. How can you be Muslim and Christian if you believe God exists in Murti? No, there's a cultural tourism aspect to it always. It's going to be, because even non-Christians are allowed to enter churches, right? Even though we don't believe in the God, even though we don't believe that God, that Jesus Christ is a God himself or a son of God, etc. So anyway, only Muslims don't let anyone enter. I have been to so many churches all my life. She also accused Vikram Sampath of plagiarism. I think she later understood the mistake with her accusation, because it immediately came out that actually plagiarism तो नहीं है, citation तो है, bibliography में दे दिया है. तो उसके बाद जब जानकी बाखले ने रिव्यू लिखा विक्रम संपत का बुक का इंडियन एक्सप्रेस में या इंडिया टुडे में, वहाँ पे थोड़ा कॉम्प्लीमेंट्स दिया, थोड़ा क्रिटिसिज्म किया, मगर कहीं पे प्लेजरिज्म लाया ही नहीं टॉपिक. ठीक है, दैट वाज इंटरेस्टिंग. सो आई डोंट नो विच वाज रिटन फर्स्ट, दैट दोज प्लेजरिज्म एलिगेशंस और दैट रिव्यू. बट चर्चेस एंड टेम्पल्स आर नॉट सेम. यस, आई नो one is a place of congregation and prayer, and one is a place of direct worship. But churches are not places of worship. Yes, they are places of congregation, unlike temples. Only temples are places of worship. And you see, when I'm going to a church as a non-Christian, I'm not going there to congregate nor pray. Then why am I being allowed to enter? And as for Dark Optimistic, that Hindutva Prakrito Itihash, is that available online? Let me know. And how big is that book? What shape would his reaction take? From his prison cell in Ratnagiri in 1923, Savarkar smuggled out a manuscript of a book, an extended essay in English, that was a passionately nationalist lyrical celebration of the Indian territorial nation. His basic argument was made in a pithy Sanskrit couplet: Asindhu Sindhu Paryanta Yasya Bharata Bhumika Pitrabhu Punyabhushchaiva Sa Vai Hinduriti Smritaha. Translated literally, the verse claims that India's geographic contours extend from the Sindhu River in the north, today in Pakistan, to the seas below in the south. Anyone at all, or anyone for whom India is both Pitra Bhumi, land of one's ancestors, and Punya Bhumi, sacred land, can be its natural and national inhabitant. See, again, she's being fair in her description here, because many Harami Qawmi scholars misrepresent this Pitrabhumi word used by Savarkar as fatherland, and therefore Hitlerish sounding fatherland. But Pitrabhumi is actually land of ancestors. One word, an abstract noun from the title of Savarkar's book, Hindutva, would come to represent the exemplary expression of militant Hindu nationalism and be a descriptive epithet that encompasses an entire ideology as well as a movement. To call someone a Hindutvadi in contemporary India is to bestow either a compliment or a contumelious insult, depending on one's ideological persuasion. For these and other reasons, Hindutva has received its share of attention from Indian historians and commentators, as has Savarkar himself. एक मिनट, मुझे ना दिखाई नहीं दे रहा है कि कितने लोग ऑनलाइन हैं. हाँ ठीक है, ओह काफ़ी लोग ऑनलाइन हैं, नॉट बैड. अच्छा. Yet, the opinion and scholarship on him remain sharply polarized. While Gandhi dominates the literature, the lives and works of other equally important nationalists such as Nehru, Ambedkar, Jinnah, E.V.R. Naikar. E.V.R. Naikar कौन है? रामस, वो हमारा पेरियार तो नहीं, या ये कोई और होगा, नाम ही तो नहीं सुना है. E.V.R. Naikar, Subhash Chandra Bose and Maulana Azad have generated some sustained critical and demanding scholarship. By contrast, Savarkar has generally been approached in straightforwardly political ways despite extraordinary contradictions in his personal and political biography. Yeah, this is my point. She is a little fairer to Savarkar than all other mainstream academics, because she's saying that अरे भाई उसको लेकर हमने रिसर्च किया ही नहीं है, इतना ostracization क्यों? Why are we invisibilizing Savarkar basically? That's her question. Even Ashish Nandi, actually Pritish Nandi's brother, Ashish Nandi wrote a thought-provoking writer who takes Savarkar seriously, uses him as the exemplary figure of a deracinated and diseased secularism. While there are some partial accounts of his life and works by scholars writing in Marathi, the mode of both English and Marathi scholarship is at best either devotional or denunciatory. Either direct Savarkar भगवान है, नहीं तो एकदम मतलब पूरा हिटलर है. This polarization may be undergirded by an unspoken assumption about the proper subjects of Indian history. And this is where I think basically Janaki Bakhle's value is. She is not taking either of those routes. She is not being completely farcical and saying that वो मतलब Hitler है, nor is she taking obviously any devotional route here. Nationalist history writing has dominated the field for generations, and only nationalists and political parties on the correct side of Indian history are taken as the subjects of sustained and serious historical inquiry and examination. के जो जीता वही सिकंदर. Barring a few notable exceptions, the almost obsessive and continued critical, historical and analytical scholarship trained on Gandhi is conspicuously absent in the case of right-wing nationalists such as Savarkar, who has been written about almost exclusively by partisan apologists and eulogizers. And ये तो वैसे भी before Sampath wrote this. This is from 2010. This has produced a woefully unbalanced historiographical account of nationalist politics and modern intellectual history. It has also meant that significant political figures and genealogies of political thought are fundamentally misunderstood when they are not altogether ignored. अगर ignore नहीं किया तो at least misunderstood तो किया ही है. As someone who clearly did not conform to the standard trajectory of Indian nationalism, Savarkar has not yet been the object of sustained academic inquiry and analysis as a major contributor to modern Indian intellectual and political history. The widely held assumption that Savarkar was a hateful fundamentalist for whom politics was aggressively Hindu is less accurate than incomplete. Savarkar's rampant prejudice against Muslims has not been overstated or misunderstood, but his key book is complicated and contingent on the context of nationalist politics in the early years of non-cooperation under Gandhi's command. It is important to understand the differences between the book and its subsequent uses, and to interpret the book and the man in the context of the contradictory impulses that swirled in the suddenly changed environment of Indian politics in the 1920s. When Savarkar was imprisoned, because एक तो प्रॉब्लम है आर्यन इन्वेजन थ्योरी का. यहाँ पे ब्राह्मो समाज सोच रहा है कि आर्यन इन्वेजन थ्योरी सही है, इसलिए हम जो लोग ब्राह्मण हैं वही तो आर्यंस है, तो पहले आर्यंस ने इन्वेट किया था, देश चलाया था ठीक से, अब हम वही करेंगे. श्री अरबिंदो सावरकर सोच रहे हैं कि इवन बाल गंगाधर तिलक के आर्यन इन्वेजन हुआ था, तो जब चलो क्या करें, इतने साल पहले हुआ था, मगर आज अगर हम आर्यन हैं तो हमको ये देश बचाना है. और कुछ लोग इतना सीरियसली ले लेते हैं आर्यन इन्वेजन थ्योरी को कि वो लोग बोलते हैं कि हाँ अब तो नाजी और हिंदुइज्म में भी एक अलायंस बन सकता है. वी हैड बंगाली नाजीज इन कोलकाता. एंड the other faction is, which still goes on in southern India and in the campuses of commie universities, that Aryan invasion theory happened, therefore the Dravidians and tribals are the oppressed class and everyone else is the oppressor. एक थ्योरी ने क्या कितनों का मार दिया, 4 branches of politics स्टार्ट कर दिया, एक मनगढ़ा कहानी. Changed environment of Indian politics in the 1920s. When Savarkar was imprisoned, the colonial government controlled the extremist developments of early nationalist mobilization. At the same time that it disenfranchised and marginalized moderates. ये डिबेटेबल है. जिन लोगों ने जैसा दीपक का इंडिया भारत पाकिस्तान पढ़ा है उन लोगों को पता होगा कि कांग्रेस का फाउंडिंग का एग्जैक्टली क्या हिस्ट्री है, मॉडरेट का कितना प्रेम था ब्रिटिश के लिए और कितना डिसएनफ्रेंचाइज किया है, वो सब हमको पता है, हमने पढ़ लिया है. इंडिया भारत पाकिस्तान ऑलमोस्ट हाफ, नहीं एक्चुअली मोर देन हाफ. द ब्रिटिश ऑल्सो अनविटिंगली क्रिएटेड द कंडीशंस अंडर विच गांधी emerged as a new kind of leader. ये सही है. His political success and strategies, however, troubled not only the British but also many nationalists, including old moderates and old extremists alike. सबको गुस्सा आ गया गांधी से. How else can one explain Savarkar's urgency to write his book? Why would someone who had spent a decade in prison and by all accounts had suffered a great deal, fallen ill, and tried hard to get out of prison, do something so foolhardy as to write a potentially seditious book? ये मुचलेका वालों को बोलो, ठीक है, अपोलोजाइज किया था. সাভারকার ने মুচলেকা দিয়েছিল সাভারকার, তো ওদেরকে গিয়ে বলো ঠিক है कि बाहर आके फिर से सेडिशियस बुक क्यों लिखा अगर उसको भाग ही जाना था ये सब लाइफ से. Why did he write it in English when his previous and future works were mostly composed in Marathi? He became even bolder. अब इंग्लिश में ही लिखूंगा, पढ़ तू. And yesterday I was watching that video by The Print on the rise of new right-wing intellectuals etc. वहाँ पे अरुण शोरी ने एक बहुत बढ़िया बात बोला, which we should always keep in mind, that you know that after all there is one major difference between the so-called right-wing intellectuals of today and the right-wing intellectuals of the 90s like Konrad L. Sitaram Goel, Arun Shori etc. that they were writing against the government. Today's intellectuals are writing things that are mostly favored by the government. तो वहाँ पे एक ऑनेस्टी और इंटेग्रिटी का मतलब एटलीस्ट करेज का सवाल तो रह जाता ही है. They were more courageous. They deserve way more respect forever and ever. And I will also say that I have not read the complete book by Vikram Sampath. I have read some excerpts. I have read J. Sai Deepak. I have read Sanjeev Sanyal. And I have read Sitaram Goel. I will say that Sitaram Goel is officially and I have read Arun Shori as well. Sitaram Goel is the most underappreciated and underrated scholar we have ever had. And that was a genuine mistake Indian society has made. Not entirely Indian society, but the criminal Indian academia has made by completely invisibilizing Sitaram Goel. Okay, in terms of scholarly work, research का जो एक अलग तरीका होता है, एक अलग टेक्निक होता है, all those criterion had also been made by Sitaram Goel. Unless you haven't read Sitaram Goel, you will never find out that Sitaram Goel was far above everyone we have today. Sanjeev Sanyal, J. Sai Deepak, Vikram Sampath. And because he was actually an MA in history or philosophy from DU, no? Okay. How else can one explain Savarkar's urgency to write his book? What a great point. I had never known this. कि बाहर आके book लिखा और seditious book ही लिखा और English में भी लिखा. See, this is why we need to read these scholars who are at least honest with facts. Someone was saying in my community section that she is the Aisha Jalal of this topic. And that is, I think, a fair description because Aisha Jalal may be a commie. She may be opposed to Hindutva. But her facts and research are so on point that people like J. Sai Deepak quote her extensively in her research, in his research. So similarly here, any right-leaning academic or sociologist or historian can easily cite her and get away with it and see these kind of compliments for Savarkar. Why would someone who had spent a decade in prison and by all accounts had suffered a great deal, fallen ill, tried hard to get out of prison, do something so foolhardy as to write a potentially seditious book? Why did he write it in English when his previous and future works were mostly composed in Marathi? Once we begin with these questions, we can also ask about his intended audience, his reasons for writing the book in the style he used, and the fundamental character of his political intervention. To do this, we must analyze the text as a response both to his time in prison and to the specific content, goals and methods of Gandhi's movement. Okay, so this is basically a review or critical analysis of the book Essentials of Hindutva. This is going to be fun. In the current literary output on Savarkar, there are a plethora of works ranging from scholarly biographies to adulatory biographies, Sanskrit plays, Sanskrit Mahakavya or courtly poetry, Povadas, bardic poems, Marathi plays, Bakhars or chronicles, Hindi plays, Marathi musicals, children's comic books and illustrated books. There is a specific regional reading public devoted to him and his memorialization. Within the Marathi lay people and scholarly world of historical writing, the nexus between the biographical persona and the literary output is differently privileged, sometimes very close, sometimes not at all. There is a varied reading practice as well when Savarkar's social work or caste politics is examined without reference to his political opinions. Such practices date to the period following Savarkar's return to India, even as the process of memorialization continues to this day. Notice of these varied reading and authorial practices rarely enter the scholarly discourse on Savarkar. This essay will use Savarkar for the purpose of expanding the scope and purview of modern Indian intellectual history and then suggest a more complicated history for Indian nationalism that addresses the present as well as the past. In my focus, mostly on a reading of the book itself, my interest is not to point out and then condemn the obvious, which is that Savarkar generates a Hindu community by excluding and demonizing Muslims. Rather, I examine and understand the deeper seductive rhetorical success of this text, without which we will continue to fail to contend with its larger political legacy. Savarkar is widely reviled in Indian history as an apostle of hate. Through a reading of Hindutva, I argue that he might better be understood as a spurned lover. Following a detailed analysis of the text and a brief consideration of Savarkar's regional heritage, I move to a consideration of the wider implications for the intellectual and political history of India in the period leading to and then dominated by Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. Last, I argue that Hindutva in its time was also a reminder to a Hindu community that even if Gandhi had left the political milieu, there was no need to worry. A political Hindu and a true nationalist was back and ready to lead India, even from behind prison walls. Hindutva was a pugilistic punch thrown against Gandhi in the competitive political ring for national leadership. Now, Essentials of Hindutva, the book. Deepex, there is no actually difference between motherland, fatherland and ancestors, no. But जब कौमी हरामी scholars fatherland बोलते हैं, they are trying to say that, this sounds like what Hitler tried to do with Germany. Therefore, some 6 million people are going to get killed here as well. So, Pitra actually is more accurately called ancestors in Sanskrit. Therefore, this explanation was more fair, I think. Essentials of Hindutva, the book. Hindutva runs only 88 pages. I never knew this, and is divided into 31 sections. The first 7 sections deal with. अच्छा, इसमें ही शायद वो 7 shackles of Hindutva है क्या? या फिर वो अलग book है? The first 7 sections deal with the issue of naming. Who is a Hindu? When do names become fixed? What is the history of names? Why is a name important? Can a name of a people be, meaning name of a group of or a society, be considered the name of a nation? Section 8 to 13 are a detour on the subject of why Buddhism as nationalism let the country down. Interesting. Section 14 returns to the Vedas, and the next 3 sections concentrate again on the issue of naming. Section 18 apologizes to Buddhism for giving offense, and Section 21 deals with foreign invaders. In sections 22 to 31, with the exception of one section devoted to a seemingly historical analysis, Savarkar returns to the issue of naming. The section that would seem most germane to his endeavor, at least from the title, Essentials of Hindutva, is only a paragraph long. I focus in my reading of Hindutva on 4 rhetorical strategies that Savarkar employs: the politics of naming, poetics of the list, enchantment of territory, and the management and evocation of affect. Through these strategies, he names into being a mythic Hindu community, identifies the magical territory it inhabits, and invokes through his enchantment of territory a militant affect of love. Savarkar uses a number of registers in Hindutva, from the theoretical and declamatory to the polemical, but the one he deploys most often is the poetic. He was, after all, a great poet. For average Marathi speakers, Hindutva, retranslated in Marathi, would be a difficult text to read, not least because Savarkar was not given to writing clear sentences in either language, but the poetic passages would be easy to memorize. Savarkar was clearly not trying to reach the same audience with his first book on the 1857 rebellion against the East India Company, written in Marathi and published before his arrest in London in 1910. The book on the 1857 rebellion was more than 500 pages long, written with the benefit of the collection of the British Library, and aimed at a nationalist rewriting of Indian and British history, using primary sources to do so. Despite its undisciplined rhetoric and large flights of fancy, it was kind of poetic. It was a very beautiful book to read. I read that about 40 pages that were on Amazon. The book's aspiration for scholarly status was apparent. It tried to come off as scholarly. No such impetus seems to have been at the work of Hindutva. वहाँ पे Savarkar gives up कि नहीं बनना है scholarly work. The politics of naming. Savarkar assigns himself only 4 questions in this text. What is in a name? What is Hindu? What is Arya? And who is a Hindu? It becomes quickly clear that the third question is the least important. The The third question is the least important, that who is an Arya? Savarkar begins by invoking Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. He does so for two reasons: because of the obvious association of Romeo and Juliet with love as a concept, and because he used it to assert right from the start that he, Savarkar, loved his name Hindu and had no desire to change it. It is a simple beginning, but it allows Savarkar to open his first declaratory statement that Hindus we are and love to remain so. It also allows him to move into the first of his quasi-theoretical claims, which is, quote, as the association of the word with the thing it signifies grows stronger and lasts long, so does the channel which connects the two states of consciousness tend to allow an easy flow of thoughts from one to the other, till at last it seems almost impossible to separate them. Savarkar does not elaborate the logic of his bestowal of consciousness to word and thing. I think this is an unfair criticism, because those are both in two different contexts, and those two contexts can easily be construed as being part of two consciousnesses which are talking about the word version and the thing version. But it should not concern us, because in general his grand theoretical and philosophically meaningless gestures are aimed at guiding his audience to the word Hindu, and to what the word Hindu has over the centuries become naturally associated with, namely a self-conscious political community. Savarkar pushes his point about a name by using a set of polemical questions. What is in a name? Call Ayodhya Honolulu, or nickname her immortal prince Puba, or ask the Americans to change Washington into a Genghis Khan. And he saves the most politically sensitive for the end of his paragraph. Persuade a Mohammedan to call himself a Jew, and you would soon find out, he suggests, just what is in a name. He seems to want to lay the groundwork for a quick version of what Reinhard Koselleck terms Begriffsgeschichte, a history of a concept, Hindutva, that has its historical marker, that had as its historical marker the name Hindu. Savarkar may have been trying to mimic the prodigious work of one of his intellectual heroes, philologist and essayist V.K. Rajwade. अच्छा ये कौन है? इनको भी पढ़ना पड़ेगा तो तब. Historian, philologist and essayist V.K. Rajwade. Rajwade, one of the two most eminent historians of Savarkar's native region, admired the scientific methodology of Western European history and believed that it should serve as the model for Maratha history. Yet, unlike Rajwade's work, Hindutva is not a systematic history but simply a road sign that allows Savarkar to assert his ultimate syllogism, which is the connection between name Hindu and place Hindustan. Indeed, as we shall see, history does not matter very much to Savarkar. Acha. Savarkar's opening sally is as follows. Quote. Now we are going to quote Savarkar directly. To this category of names which have been to mankind a subtle source of life and inspiration belongs the word Hindutva, the essential nature and significance of which we have to investigate. End quote. From the very beginning, Savarkar lets his English-educated reader know that he would like to be engaged in a quasi-Platonic project that is historical in a grand sense, part etymology, part genealogy, and part political polemic. Well, fair enough, I think. To this category of names which have been to mankind a subtle source of life and inspiration belongs the word Hindutva, the essential nature and significance of which we have to investigate. His main claim is that Hindutva is not a word but a history. Furthermore, had linguistic usage not muddied the waters over the millennia, we would have recognized that Hindutva embraces all the departments of thought and activity of the whole being of our Hindu race. The quotidian behavior of Hindus, their cultural habits, even their political opinions, all come under the reach of the term Hindutva, whether they like it or not, and whether they identify themselves as Hindu or not. It is a grand gesture of historical appropriation, and he brings this down to earth by suggesting that to understand the term Hindutva, we need to return to the word Hindu and examine its practical history, as well as the manner in which it has come to be understood. In the pages that follow, Savarkar embarks on this quest not with the etymological seriousness of Rajwade, but with a quick ticking off of the numerous examples of the use of the word Hindu through the millennia. A central technique of this appropriative historical move is Savarkar's rhetorical strategy. Hindutva does not follow a conventional literary form. It has no clear chronology, no clear narrative. It is a text that does not allow for a quick political synthesis or the ascription of an overarching metaphorical totalism. and as such it resists easy reduction. Okay, ये आई थिंक एक कॉम्प्लीमेंट है कि तुम थोड़ा स्किम थ्रू करके कोई एक नाम दे नहीं पाओगे इस बुक को. In lieu of a clear chronology and because of a lack of a clear chronology and narrative, Savarkar gives us a series of sections in which he piles assertion on assertion. In that sense, Hindutva is far less a coherent text than it is a compilation of various sentiments, passions, expressions of rage, and disparate sentimental desires. Okay, so basically a collection of his rants or thoughts, basically small essays. From his toolbox, Savarkar selects a fixed number of rhetorical and argumentative devices. He quotes from Sanskrit, Gurmukhi and old Hindi texts, but also from Marathi letters and primary source material. He uses a commonsensical declamatory tactic in which he emphasizes the obvious rather than the complex, but the most important of these techniques is his canny use of the poetics of the list. The poetics of lists. Savarkar is especially well remembered by a Marathi reading public for his poems. Among the most famous are a patriotic poem he wrote in college, Jayostute, which I actually read in my one of my videos. Another on the coast of Brighton, Sagara Prana Talamalala, I don't know how to pronounce it. And the third steeped in the language of martyrdom written to his sister-in-law, Mrityupatra, while awaiting trial in a London jail. I read the first two in one of my videos on Savarkar. His use of language in Hindutva is poetic throughout, but perhaps most so in his construction of lists of names in which he employs an incantative, liturgical and recitative tenor, along with rhyme and alliteration. 4 such lists in particular stand out. In the first list, he uses caste names along with a recurring refrain to call the community into being. Okay, now the quote from Savarkar's book. Some of us were Aryans and some Unaryans, but Ayers and Nayars, we were all Hindus and own a common blood. Some of us are Brahmins and some Namashudras or Panchams, but Brahmins or Chandals, we are all Hindus and own a common blood. Some of us are Dakshinatyas and some Gaurs, but Gaurs or Shashwats, we are all Hindus and own a common blood. Some of us were Vanars and some Kinnars, but Vanars or Nars, we are all Hindus and own a common blood. Some of us are monists, some pantheists, some theists and some atheists. But monotheists or atheists, we are all Hindus and own a common blood. Interesting. बहुत बड़ा definition हो गया हिंदू का. This was the common definition of Hindus. In each successive sentence of the passage, Savarkar uses names to build the community. Some of us were A, Aryans and some B, Unaryans, but A2, Ayers and C, Nayars, we are all Hindus. Some of us are D, Brahmans and E, Namashudras or F, Panchans but D, Brahmans or G, Chandalas, we are all Hindus. The logic is inclusive and accretive, escalating to the idea of a super religion that ignores sectarian and even confessional divides, monists, pantheists, theists and atheists, and ties everyone together by blood. The recurrent blood refrain also enables Savarkar to racialize the inclusiveness by uniting all possible attitudes toward caste, creed, and faith. While the idea of common blood owes much to contemporary racial history, Savarkar gives it a slight twist. Race produces geography, which in turn produces race. On the one hand, everyone is brought into the Hindu fold, but on the other, the boundary line between Hindus and non-Hindus is also made clear. A child group ko diagnose kiya. But then does not mean, therefore, David Frawley is not a Hindu. तो अब कोई आइडेंटिफाई करना चाहे एज अ हिंदू तब वो भी ठीक ही है. As further demonstration of the power of names to summon into being a community of readers, he uses a different set of names. Okay, now another paragraph from his book. The first cradle songs that every Hindu girl listens to are songs of Sita, the good. Some of us worship Rama as an incarnation, some admire him as a hero and a warrior. All love him as the most illustrious representative monarch of our race. Maruti and Bhimsen are the never-ending, never-failing source of strength and physical perfection to the Hindu youth. Savitri and Damayanti, the never-failing ideals of constancy and chastity of the Hindu maid. The love that Radha made to the divine cowherd in Gokul finds its echo wherever a Hindu lover kisses his beloved. The giant struggle of the Kurus,
The set duels of Arjuna and Karna, of Bhima and Dushasan, Abhimanyu, could not have been dearer to Arjun than he is to us. In the first part of this very long passage, Savarkar names key characters from epic literature not only in Sanskrit but also in multiple vernacular versions that typically reside in the blurred boundary between the mythological and the sacred. This part of the passage concludes with one quick sentence, which is, quote, "The story of Ramayana and Mahabharata alone would bring us together," end quote. But he moves in the same breath to say that the fall of Prithviraj is bewailed in Bengal, the martyred sons of Govind Singh in Maharashtra, an Arya Samajist historian in the extreme north feels that Harihara and Bukka of the extreme south fought for him, and a Sanatanist historian in the extreme south feels that Guru Tegh Bahadur died for him. The names of Mokavasya and Pisali, a Jayachand and Kalapahar makes us all feel as sinners do. The names of Ashok, Bhaskaracharya, Panini and Kapil leave us all electrified. Writing का skill तो बहुत strong है सावरकर का. Here Savarkar lays out the basic geographic contours, north, south, east, west, and in the latter part of the passage moves quickly from epic mythology, Rama, Sita, Maruti, Radha, to historical figures, Prithviraj, Harihara, Bukka. Between the two halves of this passage, we have 25 names of mythological heroes, that is lovers, Radhakrishna, warriors, Arjun, sages, grammarians, Panini, kings, a villain, Dushasan, as if to be inclusive, and religious leaders, Guru Tegh Bahadur. She's being cynical here. In other words, we have a community whose names constitute a linked footprint across the geography of much of India, some familiar, some less so. In drawing from old literary traditions, the listing of the ships in the Greek Iliad, the genealogical repetitiveness of names in the Hebrew Bible, the lists in Arabian Nights, and the use of lists in the Samhitas, Savarkar brings the historical past into the present with great intensity. He does not invent ex nihilo a new mode of writing about territory. Savarkar would certainly have been aware of both the Varkari and the Mahanubhav Marathi traditions of medieval devotional bhakti literature, in which, as Anne Feldow's shows, that the territory we know today as the modern state of Maharashtra was marked through the circulation of gods and goddesses, by the personification of rivers, and by pilgrims walking the routes punctuated by a set number of pilgrimage sites. Like Dianac's research also. People inhabited and named a sacred geography, at the same time that the region's identity was demarcated as non-North Indian in both defensive and proud expressions. Achha. Yet in such an earlier modality, the region was unambiguously religious and marked by rituals of piety and devotion. Savarkar, however, called for a modern interpretation that, in whatever way connected to an older modality, was distinctively new. Traditional pilgrimage cities and temples are not his focus, nor are sacred numbers. Instead, he animates key historical figures that move through time and space. An antique land is peopled with an ancient community, not just ancient gods. Mythology is the raw archive, poetry the instrument, the nation is the telos. Savarkar would also have been aware of the prevalence and prominence of the iterative power of names in Sanskrit prayers. To that end, his lists are performative mnemonic devices that motivate the reader's imagination to produce an ancient community as eternally alive. आज तो ये successful हो चुका है. Most important, Savarkar does not simply place a cartographic or an unambiguously religious map on India. The nation comes into being as the phantasm of a collective and selective memory. Through the names invoked in his passages, the figures are turned into peripatetic propagandists, reminding a community of the ties that bind them. As the scaffolding for his architectonic vision of this community, Savarkar also uses Sanskrit as a language that feeds all other Indian languages, which is 100% true. In an alliterative and rhyming list, he brings forth Sanskrit's progeny, quote, Gujarati and Gurumukhi, Sindhi and Hindi, Tamil and Telugu, Maharashtrian and Malayalam, Bengali and Singhali, asserting that they constitute the vital nerve thread that runs through us all, vivifying and toning our beliefs and aspirations into a harmonious whole. That Gurumukhi is a script, not a language, or that Tamil has always had independent and equal status with Sanskrit is of course important to note. But perhaps the more important point is not the list's historical inaccuracy, but its similarity to the hymn composed by the Indian Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore that was sung at the 1911 session of the Indian National Congress and was later adopted as India's national anthem. Tagore is explicitly cited by Savarkar a few passages later to present a native son whom all of India would claim as their poet, in contradicting distinction to Shakespeare, as if to disavow his opening reference. Okay. Now Savarkar is going to talk about Rabindranath Tagore. Adi Puran was not written by a Sanatani, yet the Adi Puran is the common inheritance of the Sanatanis and Jains. Okay, who wrote Adi Puran, guys? What's the mystery here? The Vasav Puran is the Bible of the Lingayat, but it belongs to Lingayats and non-Lingayat Hindus alike. As one of the foremost and historical Kannadisi works extant. Vachittar Natak of Guru Gobind Singh is as truly the property of a Hindu in Bengal as the Chaitanya Charitamrit is of a Sikh. Exactly what I was saying a few days back. That अब तो छत्रपति शिवाजी सिर्फ मराठी राजा नहीं है, आज वो हमारे भी राजा है, मेरे राजा है, वो तो आज पूरे भारत के राजा है. Krishnadeva is not just Karnataka's king, he is today India's king. Sri Aurobindo is not my property. He is a revolutionary of Marathis as well. Kalidas and Bhavabhuti, Charak and Sushrut, Aryabhat and Varahamihir, Bhas and Ashwaghosh, Jayadev and Jagannath wrote for all of us, appeal to us all, are the cherished possession of us all. Let the work of Kamb, the Tamil poet, and say a copy of Hafiz be kept before a Hindu in Bengal, and if he be asked, what belongs to you of these? He would instinctively say, Kamb is mine. Let a copy of Rabindranath and that of Shakespeare be kept before a Hindu in Maharashtra. He would claim Ravinder is mine. Adi Purana is a 9th century Sanskrit poem composed by Jinasena, a Digambara monk. Acha, so he was not from India or what? He was from Tibet, China region. Okay, so guys, linguistic regionalism has been absolutely destroyed here. Here, Savarkar works with languages, texts and authors to create a nexus between unity and diversity. Exactly what we need. The texts from one part of the country ought to be part of the collective memory of the entire community. Exactly what I said a few days back. The end of the passage, a Hindu in Maharashtra could describe Savarkar himself, and in his use of the alliterative Gujarati and Gurmukhi, he was clearly following in Tagore's poetic footsteps. Especially calling to mind the hymn Tagore wrote in 1911, but also his own poem written in prison in 1913 in praise of Rabindranath Tagore. Are Bangali muchleka kore jacche. Mythic, geography and enchantment of territory. Savarkar's okay, let me have a sip of coffee now. উপনিষদের নেম আছে দাদা বৃহদারণ্যিকা উপনিষদ নিয়ে ট্রোল হয়ে যাচ্ছি ওয়াইফ বিটিং এর সিন আছে অলসো গট ট্রোল্ড বাই ট্র্যাডস ইন देयर সার্ভার দে ক্লেম ইট ওয়াজ ফাইন এন্ড দে উইল ডু ইট তো দে উইল গো টু জেল ফর ইট তো ये दिस इज लाइक अ सेल्फ गोल लाइक व्हाट कॉमीज से why are we leaving the world to bad people, and therefore we are not going to have kids, so we are going to definitely leave the world to bad people who are apparently having kids, and they are going to self demolish their race. Basically there's going to be no such thing left, no such thing called commie woke Bengali left in 50 years, because half of them to I'm going to destroy by debating, and the rest of them are not going to have any kids. This is like that. तो जेल में बैठ के मराओ, ट्रेडिज्म कितना मरवाना है. Okay. Savarkar's poetic evocation of geography was meant both to call attention to the land itself and to use the tropes of cartography to assert the fundamental unity of Hindustan, which is, quote, "It was in this land that the founders of our faith and the seers to whom Ved, the knowledge, was revealed, from Vedic seers to Dayanand, from Jin to Mahabir, from Buddh to Nagsen, from Nanak to Gobind, from Banda to Basav, from Chakradhar to Chaitanya, from Ramdas to Ram Mohan, our gurus and godmen were born and bred."
end quote. Yet again, we see his penchant for alliteration. Of course, that's beautiful poetry. And he uses alliterative names to move to territory. Quote, the very dust of its paths echoes the footfalls of our prophets and gurus. Sacred are its rivers, hallowed its groves, for it was either on their moonlit ghats or under their eventide long shadows, that the deepest problems of life, of man, soul and God, of Brahma and Maya, were debated and discussed by a Buddha or a Shankar, end quote. Having named a community, he has moved to the territory it has always inhabited. In his choice of the words sacred and hallowed, he also imbues the territory with heightened value. It is in these passages that Savarkar also shows his sense that, as a register, poetry is superior to history in enchanting a territory in which he has already located his eternal and peripatetic community. Yeah, I'm reading a book by Nietzsche currently. It's a collection of some of Nietzsche's essays on truth. The compilation book is called On Truth and Untruth. It's a very small book. You all should buy it. It costs about 300-400 rupees. You can if you read it in one go, I think it will take max 2 days to finish. Okay, I'm not being able to read it in one go or too long. But there, what Nietzsche was talking about, saying about history or truth, even that basically goes exact word for word with the definition of itihasa as we have. That if we are just going to memorize some random facts, that अच्छा वहाँ पे जैसे कि आईसी बोर्ड में एटलीस्ट हमको तो पता है सिर्फ आईसी बोर्ड का कि हिस्ट्री कैसे पढ़ा जाता था, which was insanely boring and impossibly tough to remember unless you had some मतलब academic push in your family कि नहीं पढ़ाई में अच्छा होना ही है बेंचोत, अगर या फिर तुम्हारा कुछ मतलब academic leaning वैसे ही बन गया, तुमको पढ़ना अच्छा लगता है, unless you had these two things in your life, you would never get away with getting good marks in history, okay, in IC board at least, because what we were taught is just अच्छा उस दिन में एग्जैक्ट वो दिन में उस घड़ी में नेहरू वहाँ पे गया था, उस दिन में यहाँ पे गांधी गया था, उस दिन में यहाँ पे गांधी ने ये किया, और डेट्स कोई नैरेटिव नहीं है कुछ, वो मेमोराइज करने का क्या फ़ायदा अनलेस यू आर जस्ट टेस्टिंग मी फॉर लेटर यूपीएससी एग्जाम कि कितना इन्फॉर्मेशन स्टोर कर सकता है ब्रेन में. दैट इज़ नॉट द पॉइंट ऑफ हिस्ट्री. वो हिस्ट्री, अरे भाई हिस्ट्री से अगर कुछ सीख नहीं सके तो क्या फ़ायदा है, और सिर्फ मेमोराइजेशन से हम क्या सीख सकते हैं. नैरेटिव तो लाना है, तो नैरेटिव तो है वैसे इंडियन हिस्ट्री में कि गांधी ने सब कुछ किया और मुस्लिम किंग्स काफ़ी अच्छे थे, मगर वो भी बहुत घटिया तरीके से लिखा गया है. तो एक्चुअली Nietzsche agrees with what Savarkar is doing here and what itihasa is essentially, that make a story out of it and focus on the and bring out, emphasize on the good lessons that we can learn from history. Don't just go around saying that okay, on this date Arjuna did that, on this date Mahabharata happened. No, go home. It is in these passages that Savarkar also shows his sense that as a register, poetry is superior to history in enchanting a territory in which he has already located his eternal and peripatetic community. Quote, every hill and dell distinct with memories of a Kapil or a Vyas, Shankar or Ramdas, end quote. In one sentence, he moves across millennia from a mythological sage, Vyas, to a 17th century to a 17th century mendicant Guru Ramdas. As the passage continues, Savarkar uses didactic and performative gestures as if to grab his readers by the arm and make him or her look closely in every direction to which he points. वो Gangs of Wasseypur वाला scene, देख. Here, quote, here Bhagirath rules, there Kurukshetra lies. Here Ramchandar made his first half of an exile, there Janaki saw the golden deer. Here is Bodhivraksha, here the deer park. Here Mahavir entered Nirvana, italics mine. The use of the indexical adverbs here and there can be felicitous only when the object pointed to is both intimate and proximate, both spatially close here and temporally immediate now. Good analysis actually. The passage comes to a thundering close when Savarkar calls forth another familiar trope. Quote, every stone here has a story of martyrdom to tell. Every inch of thy soil, O mother, has been a sacrificial ground. End quote. Not only is there a mythic community in a magical land, but all parts of this intimate land have been made sacred by sacrifice. Martyrdom is very powerful in mobilizing a community, and when Savarkar is not being asked to prove his claims, it is even stronger.
In the following passage, the elevation of territory is more apparent. In the last section of the book, unique natural blessings to Hindustan, Savarkar writes, quote, "She is the richly endowed daughter of God. This is our motherland." End quote. Savarkar had a complicated relationship with the questions of religion and faith, eschewing many rituals and dietary taboos that were a part of everyday Marathi Brahman life. He reserved his most exuberant praise and religious sensibility under the sign of secular nationalism for the land. He continues, quote, "Her rivers are deep and perennial. Her land is yielding to the plough and her fields loaded with golden harvests. Rich in her fauna, rich in her flora, she knows she owes it all to the immediate source of light and heat, the sun." End quote. In the same passage, Savarkar sets in motion a sharp contrast between Mother Ganges and Father Thames, personifications of colonized India and colonizing England. He also takes aim at the generally popular notion that warm climates generally generate lassitude. कितना कुछ घुसा दिया एक लाइन में. Quote, "She, Mother India, covets not the icy lands. Blessed be they and their frozen latitudes. If heat is at times enervating here, cold is at times benumbing there. If cold induces manual labor, heat removes much of its very necessity. She takes more delight in quenched thirst than in the parched throat. Father Thames is free to work at feverish speed, wrapped in his icy sheets. She loves to visit her ghats and watch her boats." बाप रे, क्या writing है? She likes to watch her boats gliding down the Ganges on her moonlit waters. With the plough, the peacocks, the lotus, the elephant and the Gita, she is willing to forego, if that must be, whatever advantage the colder latitudes enjoy. Her gardens are green and shady, her granaries well stocked, her waters crystal, her flowers scented, her fruits juicy, her herbs healing. Her brush is dipped in the colors of dawn and her flute resonant with the music of Gokul. Not only does Savarkar render India sacred and magical, but he puts in place a national narcissism, which is India loves to watch herself carefully and without haste, unlike the feverish but frigid Father Thames. More to the point, this passage offers a clue as to why Savarkar wrote in English. The contrast of climates and peoples is a direct rebuttal of the 19th century colonial discourse of the tropical environment with its bodies and civilizations, which maintained that cold climates produce energetic, progressive and productive bodies, whereas the tropics brought forth lassitudinous, slothful, stagnant and degenerative ones. Given that the colonial discourse on the climatic theory of civilization was largely in English, it stands to reason that Savarkar responded in the same language and idiom for an English-educated native class that once schooled in the language and rhetoric of English increasingly resented such narratives of their native inferiority. And this is what basically Modi quoted Nehru saying, that Indians are known to be lazy. Indians are mostly lazy. For a contemporary reader, the above passages in their overly sentimental recasting of Tennysonian poetry in hybrid Indo-Anglian prose may well call to mind the cloying tone of a Hallmark card. Yet, against the backdrop of the failure of the non-cooperation movement to have accomplished any real gains, these would have been intensely moving and evocative passages, conveying as they do a kind of epic quality to the land. It is hardly adequate to aver that Savarkar had a simple, exclusionary geography of the nation in mind. He recognized that nationalism did not need history. Myths could provide an easy substitute for history or historical accuracy. What nationalism did need was geography and territoriality, and Savarkar provides it in plenty. He conjures a nation into being by melding an older poetic literary trope and technique with a modern hybrid sensibility. He would have had access to the concept of a sacred Maharashtra, and the use of poetry to invoke a sacred territory would have been familiar. Yet he did not choose. He did not choose Marathi or Sanskrit. He wanted the English readers to read this. He did not choose मराठी. अच्छा, एक बहुत बड़ा फुटनोट है, देख लेते हैं. Okay, let's just check this. See also Yagal Shulman and David Bronner, A Cloud Turned Goose, Indian Economic. While the aim of the article is to challenge Pollock's claim that in the second millennium, Sanskrit was no longer the language of literary or politico-theoretical innovation, in regard to Venkatanatha's 14th century Sanskrit answer, the Hamsa Sandesa to the canonical Kalidasa's Megha Sandesa, Shulman and Bronner also provide an analysis of an early modern poetic sensibility that incorporates and imagines the geographic and territorial world of the southern Tamil region. I am grateful to Rosalindo Hanlon for pointing me in this direction and for helping me think through the early modern connections to the invocation of territory. Okay. Yet he did not choose Marathi or Sanskrit as languages in which to compose Hindutva. He wrote it in English. When he had been taken to the Andamans, English was the main voice of anti-colonial politics, given that the annual sessions of the Indian National Congress were conducted in it, and people who could not speak English were asked to stay away from the Indian National Congress. Savarkar's hybrid Indo-Anglian style, with its elevated prose and poetic lists, bespeaks a particular political savvy in generating and reaching out to a trans-regional and middle-class national audience rather than an audience that would only read in Marathi. At a time of colonial occupation, while Savarkar was in prison and when many other nationalist leaders were imprisoned or at the very least demoralized and dispirited, he produced an English text in which he invoked prophets, seers and the authors of ancient texts from the four corners of India as if they were ancestors of the present moment, available to invest the nation with an ancient pedigree and a more hopeful future. If Savarkar's early writing career included historical work, in Hindutva, he largely abandoned history itself. Of the 31 sections in his work, only in one does he attempt historical analysis. The first historical event is a mythic one. The first sacrificial fire was lit on the banks of the Indus long before the ancient Egyptian and Babylonian civilizations appeared on record. Here begins history for Savarkar with sacrifice and the ancient Aryans. Here too begins the naming process. Even if the ancient Aryans came from elsewhere and encountered the Indus Valley civilization when they arrived, they, the Aryans, would not have coined utterly new names for everything but would have used the words the locals used, making only minor changes. From this, Savarkar derives the claim that the Aryans turned the word Hindu into Sindhu because of the peculiarity of their tongue, which turned the H into Sh. Interesting. But Savarkar is not interested in... So he's assigning that to Savarkar. But Savarkar assigned that to Aryans. But Savarkar is not interested in reclaiming the term Aryan and dismisses attempts made in this time by Hindus to do so. His interest is in the term Hindu. In 1923, the term Aryan would have alienated large numbers of South Indian nationalists who were not keen to be incorporated into such a fold. With all the attendant racism and prejudice the term brought with it, South Indian nationalism was voiced the language of Dravidianism in stark opposition to the quote-unquote Aryan thesis, and the term Hindu, as Savarkar used it, bypassed the antagonism. Aryan nahi bolunga, to tum mere fold mein aa jao. Interesting. Did she just criticize Dravidianism? Look at this. In 1923, the term Aryan would have alienated large South Indian nationalists who were not keen to be incorporated into such a fold with all the attendant... She's talking about the word Aryan only. The word Aryan would have had with all the attendant racism and prejudice the term brought with it, not Dravidianism. Okay. So Savarkar bypassed the antagonism by not using the word Aryan. From the fire of ritual sacrifice, Savarkar turns to water, using rivers as civilizational landmarks, which Vinayak also did. He employs Sanskrit quotations liberally throughout the work, but they are more pronounced in the first part, as if the language were the essential scaffolding for his edifice. In the second Sanskrit quotation, he names the rivers, Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Satadru and Godavari. Here too, Savarkar must have drawn from an earlier Marathi Varkari tradition, but he does not dwell on any one aspect. From riverine civilization, he moves quickly through Puranic mythology, that the Distance between the early Rigvedic period and the Puranic period is immense, does not bother him. Yeah, why should it? Historical accuracy is irrelevant. What is important is the simple textual or recorded presence of the word Hindu. Exactly, that is his point. Whether as Hindu or Sindhu, because it allows his chief assertion that the nation has its origins in a named community. Moving from a small group to nation was for him an inexorable and inevitable step, the tracing of which is one of the central tasks of his essay. But what about the Muslims? There is a subtle but important shift in perspective when Savarkar addresses the main non-Hindu group that constitutes the Indian nation, namely the Muslims. Hindutva is assumed by contemporary Indians to be Savarkar's most odious text, in which he vents his rage and prejudice against the Muslim community in India more vehemently and succinctly than he does anywhere else. In fact, he writes far more polemically elsewhere, especially in texts, prose, drama and poetry written after Hindutva. In Hindutva itself, Savarkar writes about Muslims mainly in one section, 21, titled Foreign Invaders. He begins with a loosely Hegelian dialectical claim about national consciousness. Quote, nothing makes self-conscious of itself so much as the conflict with the non-self. Out-group बनाओ, self वैसे ही in-group वैसे ही तैयार हो जाएगा. Like his other quasi-theoretical claims, it is abandoned quickly to name and enumerate Islam as a world historical force colliding with nations. His claims begin with Mahmud of Ghazni's invasion. Quote, from year to year, decade to decade, century to century, the contest continues. Arabia ceased to be what Arabia was. Iran annihilated. Egypt, Syria, Afghanistan, Balochistan, Tartary, from Granada to Ghazni. Nations and civilizations fell in heaps before the sword of Islam of peace. It's interesting that these kind of narratives and sentences even are basically parroted by all of us who are sort of new to this kind of politics, and even kids, Zoomers, okay, on Twitter all day. So it's such a unfortunate but late success of people like Savarkar that what he was saying as sort of a fringe, underground, radical thinker, these conversations are now mainstream, are being said on mainstream TV news channel panel debates, college campuses, Twitter, everywhere. Success देर से भी आता है कुछ लोगों को. Following this, the Indo-Islamic millennium is depicted as yet another series of collisions, this time not Islam as an autonomous world historical force against extant nations, but one nation in particular, India, against a multitude of Muslim ethnic groups, named as Arabs, Persians, Pathans, Balochis, Tatars, Turks, Mughals. Okay, and this sentence, I know she's not making this as a criticism, she's just describing it, but this is word for word, almost 90% exactly what Ambedkar also wrote in his criticism of Islam and Muslims in Pakistan or partition of India. He says that Ambedkar says that Muslims are always ready to kill each other. The Tatar is fighting the Mongol is fighting Afghans, etc. The only thing they have in common is that Hinduओं को मारना है. They have their out-group set. So I think therefore, if at all she was meaning it as a criticism, that वो तो थोड़ा Hegelian एक theory बना लिया कि out-group ढूंढो in-group वैसे ही बन जाएगा. That need not be that serious of a criticism, because I'm assuming that these people have gigantic respect for Ambedkar, and Ambedkar says the same thing about Muslims as well. The full weight of his rage and prejudice is prejudice word बार-बार बोल रहा है without any claims to without any evidence to back up this thing. Everything else she's saying, rage तो ठीक है, तो हाँ मतलब गुस्सा है वो पता है, but prejudice is a very loaded term, and as a honest and legit scholar, I think she should have absolutely avoided the word prejudice repeatedly. ये वो prejudice है तुमको कैसे पता? उसका कुछ एविडेंस दो कि क्यों prejudice है. बार बार बोल रहा है एक डायरेक्ट ad hominem criticism. Prejudice. The full weight of his rage and prejudice is expressed in the following ungrammatical combination. Quote, religion is a mighty motive force, so is rapine. But where religion is goaded on by rapine and rapine serves as a handmaid to religion, the propelling force that is generated by these together is only equaled by profundity of human misery and devastation they leave behind them in their march. Religion is equated with rapine, not a word common to the English language. The combination, however, is used to signal the carnage Savarkar thought had been wrought on quote-unquote nations and civilizations, but not communities, individuals or people. Long before Samuel Huntington, Savarkar's view of this clash was that of civilizational warfare fought as a national and ethnic battle. And Samuel Huntington is the person who, for those of you who don't know, is one who first came up with this idea that there is wrote a book called Clash of Civilizations, जो कि आज एक almost mainstream view बन गया है कि ईस्टर्न इन एशियन सिविलाइजेशन एक है, या फिर हिंदू सिविलाइजेशन एक है, इस्लामिक सिविलाइजेशन एक है, एक वेस्टर्न सिविलाइजेशन है, विच इज़ क्रिटिसाइज्ड बाय अमर्त्य सेन इन हिज बुक, वो मैंने जो रिसेंटली ख़त्म किया ना, आइडेंटिटी एंड वायलेंस. वहाँ पे अमर्त्य सेन रिजेक्ट्स दिस वर्ल्ड व्यू इट सेल्फ, दैट डोंट व्यू दीज कंट्रीज और लोकेलिटीज और पीपल फ्रॉम द लेंस ऑफ civilization itself, because civilization, you are basing that in some customary rituals or religion, and that cannot be the complete story, because that's just one dimension of a person's identity. But there are many dimensions. You are many things at one time. Your profession is there, your religion is there, your food habit is there. So that's Amartya Sen's criticism. I don't know how much valid it is. I have not thought about it too much. But one thing I like Amartya Sen's book for is that Amartya Sen specifies in the beginning only that why his later criticism of civilization need not be taken that seriously, is that he says that of course a person has many identities, but at different points in his time, in his life, it is fair that a person prioritizes one identity of his over everything else. So based on that, I'm saying that at the moment our Hindu identity is the most important thing at the moment, because of the scene, the political, legal, judicial scenario of the world and our country. Was that of civilizational warfare fought as a national and ethnic battle. So basically this is a compliment that even before such a known author or philosopher thinker like Samuel P. Huntington, Savarkar wrote this before him, that this was an attack by the Islamic civilization on the Hindu civilization. The collapse of the Indo-Islamic millennium into decades and centuries of ceaseless conflict is nonetheless interrupted by a decisive moment in the passage. Quote, India single-handedly kept the fight morally and militarily. The moral victory was won when Akbar came to the throne and Darashikoh was born. Darashikoh. In a section that begins with violence, in which religion and rapine in capital letters are descriptive of Islam, the only instances of India's quote-unquote moral victory is the historical enthronement of a Mughal emperor and the birth of his great-grandson. No more information is given to the reader about Akbar or Darashikoh. It is simply a declamation, because we all know why Savarkar mentioned them, of course. But subsequent to the declamation, through a confused accounting of the Battle of Panipat, the loss of the Hindu army, and the triumphant march of the Marathas, there is no additional moment of moral victory. Why is Akbar singled out as the moral Indian? A prefiguring of his moral argument can be seen in Savarkar's first major historical work on the 1857 rebellion against the East India Company. While a student in London, and over the course of 2 years, 1908 to 1909, Savarkar had written a monumental tome in which he presented a systematic analysis of the rebellion as a failed war of national independence. Attuned to nationalism as a historical force around the globe, he argued that the revolt of 1857 had reflected the unified Hindu-Muslim nationalist desire of India to free itself from the oppressive yoke of British rule. He wrote his work in Marathi using English primary sources precisely to highlight the ideological biases in the imperial perspective, in the British perspective, on the subject, to argue that, quote, the nation ought to be the master and not the slave of its own history, end quote. Savarkar discounted colonial arguments about the causes of the 1857 rebellion, the greased cartridge, the economic motives of the elite, the annexation of Awadh, etc. In chapter after chapter, he noted that the rebellion had ushered in a new era, in particular, the end in perpetuity of Hindu-Muslim enmity. That, according to Savarkar, that was the end of Hindu-Muslim enmity, and he imagined a future for India with its two distinct religious communities bound together in an unshakable unity. He also, and ये तो मेरा आर्ग्यूमेंट है कि ये बार बार हो सकता था, किसी ना किसी ने लास्ट मोमेंट में आके फिर से आग लगा दिया है. अली मियाँ हैड सेड दैट राम जन्मभूमि दे देते हैं, क्या है, हम तो वैसे भी वहाँ पे प्रेयर करने नहीं जाते, चलो हमारे तरफ से भी एक थोड़ा कोऑपरेशन हो. आफ्टर बीजेपी केम टू पावर एंड स्टार्टेड बैनिंग बीफ, some big Maulana in Rajasthan, I think near the Ajmer Dargah or in the Ajmer Sharif only, had said that yes, why shouldn't beef be banned? They are making so many sacrifices, they respect our blasphemies, so why shouldn't we respect their one blasphemy? तो वहाँ पे तो मार्क्सिस्ट हिस्टोरियन आके फिर से आग लगाता है कि नहीं नहीं क्यों क्यों राम जन्मभूमि दोगे, वहाँ पे अंदर अंदर बुद्धिस्ट मॉनेस्ट्री था भाई. He also indicted the British for conspiring to trample the Hindu religion and the Muslim faith, or as he also put it, for being filled with contempt for the Hindu and Muslim faiths, the two principal religions of India. In an extraordinary passage, by no means uncommon in the book, Savarkar wrote of a fallen Muslim warrior, Maulvi Ahmed Shah, quote, "As soon as the news of his death reached England, the relieved Englishmen felt that the most formidable enemy of the British in northern India was no more. In person, the Maulvi was tall, lean, and muscular, with large, deep-set eyes, beetle brows, high aquiline nose, and lantern jaws. It is impossible to find a character who has illuminated the history of this nation with more noble patriotism than this hero. The life of this brave Mohammedan shows that a deep faith in the doctrines of Islam is in no way inconsistent with or antagonistic to deep and all-powerful love of the Indian soil. That a Mohammedan dominated by an uncommonly spiritual impulse can, at the same time, nay, by the very fact of his being so dominated, be also a patriot of the highest excellence, offering his very lifeblood on the altar of Mother India, so that she might lift her head as an independent and free country, and that the true believer in Islam will feel it a pride to belong to and a privilege to die for his mother country." Clearly, there was a romantic sense of patriotic brotherhood between Hindus and Muslims, and a sense of common motherland in whose cause plenty of blood had been spilled by martyrs, Hindu and Muslim alike. When we skip forward a decade to Hindutva, the compact between Hindus and Muslims appears to be in flux. Given that the Mughals were placed in a history that began with Arabs and included Tatars and Turks, one might assume that there were no distinctions to be made among Mughal emperors, if they all represented a millennium of quote-unquote rapine and religious conflict. Yet, Savarkar introduces a crucial dichotomy between model nationalist Indian, that is Akbar, Dara Shikoh, Maulvi Ahmed Shah, etc., and non-nationalist Indian. Fair enough, actually. For example, in that Maharaja's British in the I think the last live stream also we were discussing that the last Maharaja of Kashmir, he had his own army. In that army there were Hindus and Muslims, and as soon as independence was declared, Pakistan army gave a call for jihad. The Muslim soldiers of that army cut the throats of the Hindu soldiers and threw them in the Jhelum river, or tortured some of them to death. Conversely, few days later, the actual Indian army reaches there, and the Lion of Naushera, a Muslim man who was repeatedly invited to come to Pakistan and become the general of the Pakistan army, he says, "No, fuck off, I'm not coming to Pakistan, I'm serving my country." And he goes there, liberates Kashmir, and kicks out all the Pakistanis and all the Muslim terrorists. And the next day, he's having a cup of coffee in front of his tent, and right then one shell comes from the Pakistan side, blasts in front of his face, and he dies. And his burial today is in the Jamia Millia Islamia campus or adjacent to that place, which is repeatedly destroyed from time and again by people who hate that I keep forgetting his original name, but he is called the Lion of Naushera. So they keep destroying his burial because that why did he fight for India? Secular Savarkar. When we skip, कहाँ तक हुआ? हाँ. So yet Savarkar introduces a crucial dichotomy between model nationalist Indian, Akbar, Dara Shikoh, Maulvi Ahmed Shah, and non-nationalist Indian. He does not simply dichotomize model Muslim and immodel Muslim. Furthermore, good. He's not getting into the religious aspect of it. Furthermore, it is not only the last powerful Mughal emperor Aurangzeb, but also Gandhi as the chief addressee of Hindutva, who will occupy the latter category. Akbar and Maulvi Ahmed Shah, separated by 2 centuries, are juxtaposed against Aurangzeb and Gandhi. What a brilliant way to analyze this. I'm talking about Savarkar here. Separated, and so many years back, these things are mainstream now, common now. Separated by the same span of time. Moreover, Aurangzeb and Gandhi are the 2 figures at the receiving end of Savarkar's angriest rhetoric. To understand the conflation, I propose between Aurangzeb and Gandhi as inadequately nationalist I propose Aurangzeb and Gandhi as inadequately nationalist in Savarkar's text. We need to move to the only historical section of the essay. Okay. Let me have some water now. Brigadier Muhammad Usman, right. The centrality of the Shivaji Aurangzeb conflict. In the section following foreign invaders, Savarkar offers the only historical analysis to be had in the book. Section 22, titled Hindutva at Work, running 16 and a half pages, single-mindedly plows through the Indo-Islamic millennia until it comes to the Aurangzeb-Shivaji conflict. As against the moral Akbar of the previous section, we are now introduced to his nemesis, the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, who reigned nearly half a century. But Savarkar gives his reader no information about Aurangzeb. Instead, he is introduced only through his chief antagonist, the Maratha chieftain, ruler of the Deccan region, Shivaji Maharaj. Shivaji had rebelled against the emperor, established his own Maratha empire in 1664, and crowned himself Chhatrapati in 1674. The centrality of the Shivaji-Aurangzeb conflict is key to understanding the main argument of Hindutva. The breakaway rule founded by Shivaji took as its originating moment an act of resistance to a centralizing Mughal empire. Little more than a century later, the Maratha Empire would be handed its most decisive defeat by the forces of the British East India Company precisely because of a lack of organization and unity between key Maratha nobles. During the long 19th century, both the founding moment of Shivaji's empire and the eventual defeat of the Marathas came to dominate the historical imagination of Western India. Shivaji was narrativized in a wide variety of literary genres as the apotheosis of a masculine Maratha Hindu nationalism. At the same time, the defeat of Shivaji's successors became the founding moment for an anti-colonial nationalist rhetoric. While anti-colonial nationalism and regional pride and chauvinism might seem to pull in two different directions, one regional and insular and the other national and inclusive, the two strands of nationalism and regional insularity were braided in part because of Shivaji's trans-regional ambitions. The most striking Marathi tone against colonial perceptions of Indian history in the late 19th century was struck by a young school teacher, Vishnu Shastri Chiplankar. I've heard his name. In 1874, Chiplankar founded a magazine called Nibandhmala, Garland of Essays. It was fiery in tone, scathing in sarcasm, and addressed to a specifically Marathi readership. Chiplankar died young, but what age? 1850 to 33 में मर ही गए वो. Chiplankar died young, but through his magazine and his acerbic and polemical prose style known as Chiplankari Walan, he left a deep imprint on many of the emerging Marathi literati of his time. His chief influence was to exhort Marathi publics to proudly reclaim their past glories under Shivaji by writing scientific history. One of the intellectual giants of Maharashtra inspired by Chiplankar's call was Rajwade, whose work Savarkar knew well. In a recent essay, Milind Wakankar reads Rajwade's first critical edition of a 13th century text, the Dhyaneshwari, to examine the specific frame within which history is imagined and installed in Western India, with its attendant gains, Indian/Hindu nationalism, and losses, the richness of the Indo-Islamic millennium. Wakankar argues that Rajwade's use of the ancient grammarian Panini to Brahmanize the text was an index of his nationalist attempt to bend a 13th century text retroactively into a narrative of Maratha history to prepare the grounds for the retrospective autochthony of Marathi in an uncontaminated Hindu antiquity. Well said. Rajwade's critical edition of the Dhyaneshwari was published in 1909, the same year in which Savarkar wrote his own history of the 1857 rebellion against the East India Company, and Gandhi wrote Hind Swaraj. All that happened in 1909. बाप रे, बहुत लोगों का बुक खरीदते खरीदते पैसा खत्म हो गया होगा उस साल में. So, Chiplankar inspires Rajwade, Rajwade inspires Savarkar, and Milind Wakankar is some other scholar who talks about Rajwade. Okay, बहुत सारे नाम आ गए last 5 minutes में. Okay. While a mainstream and Bengal-centered Indian nationalist narrative in later years would write off the revolutionary movement that began in Maharashtra as disorganized, lacking in both leadership and ideology, the colonial police at the time took it very seriously. The nerve center of the revolutionary movement in the Deccan, as the colonial government through its extensive machinery of surveillance came to recognize, was dispersed over several cities: Aurangabad, Amravati, Nasik, Nagpur and Ratnagiri. A large number of young Marathi men were rounded up and imprisoned for their revolutionary beliefs and for engaging in bomb making and the acquisition of firearms. A cult soon developed around the actions of everyday poor Marathi Brahmins, Chiplankar and later Savarkar and his family, in smaller towns and cities, many of whom had sacrificed all in the service of anti-colonial revolution. Martyrdom in the service of saving the nation from the clutches of her foreign oppressors, Zulmi Satta, became something of a celebratory trope in small towns in Maharashtra by the late 19th century. The sway of Rajwade's influential conception of Maharashtra as a state in waiting, its history beginning decisively with the compact between a sage's militancy, Guru Ramdas, and militant warriors, sagacity. क्या ये बहुत बढ़िया सेंटेंस है. ये तो किसी और का साइटेशन होगा. किसका साइटेशन है ये? 74. एक मिनट ज़रा देख लेते हैं किसको साइट कर रही है. अच्छा, वो वाकंकड़ को. Beautiful sentence. The sway of Rajwade's influential conception of Maharashtra as a state in waiting to be liberalized or gain freedom. Its history beginning decisively with the compact between a sage's militancy, Guru Ramdas, and a militant warrior's sagacity. And actually, Rabindranath Tagore has written both about Guru Ramdas and Shivaji, which I have read out from my channel in both English and Bengali, and analyzed the poem. Was given additional ballast by yet another Chiplankar admirer, the leader of the so-called extremist wing of the INC, Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Revered as a nationalist hero by both Savarkar and Gandhi, Tilak added another dimension to the persistence of Shivaji as a figure who could lead the way as he had earlier done. He inaugurated the publicly celebrated religious festival Sarvajanik Puja as a means of circumventing the colonial ban against political associations. In 1893, he started the first Ganapati Puja, and in 1896, he sponsored the first annual public celebration of the birthday of Shivaji Maharaj. Genius. The festivals were a public celebration of a proto-nationalist leader and provided the venue for his commemoration in a populist and joyful idiom. Shivaji epitomized the homegrown guerrilla David against a centralizing foreign Goliath. The festival led to large numbers of Marathi men writing ballads and celebratory poems commemorating the relationship between Shivaji and Guru Ramdas. Savarkar participated with gusto in such commemorative activities as writing patriotic poems about Shivaji's earlier years. But when it came to writing in a historical mode, and in particular in Hindutva, he altered the conception of history Rajwade held earlier. What kind of history does nationalism need? Interesting question. Yeah, Abhay, genius move by Tilak. What kind of history does nationalism need? What a great question. Rajwade's lasting contribution, according to Wakankar, was the attempt to install history itself at the heart of language, to try to prove that a language and a history are coterminous. During the 19th century, the historical relationship between Maratha, caste name, Marathi, language, Brahman, caste name, and Maharashtrian, anglicized term for regional inhabitants who spoke Marathi and could belong to any number of castes, was increasingly conflated. Savarkar would both use and extend such a conflation. While he was clearly comfortable with the proposition that Marathi nationalist history began with the compact between Guru Ramdas and Shivaji, his own conception of Indian history stretched far beyond the bounds that Rajwade imposed on it by placing around it regional scare quotes. Savarkar dilutes and expands Rajwade's conception of history through his insistence in Hindutva that a name was a concept and history at the same time. In effect, through Savarkar's deliberate delineation of each occurrence of the word Hindu, he makes a new kind of historical argument by repetition and accretion, the mere listing of mythological names sufficing as proof. Savarkar understood, is that, I don't know, in some context it might not be wrong, after all, politics is important to get some things done. So, especially in a
sort of a colonial government तो में तो ज़रूरी है ही, then parliamentary democracy. Monarchy के अलावा जब भी कुछ होगा उसमें ऐसे चीज़ें होंगे, और अगर मोनार्की भी है तब भी वो राजा ने कितना बड़ा काम किया है, राजा कौन से भगवान का डिसेंडेंट है, ये सब लिखने के लिए भी, स्तुति करने के लिए भी कुछ ना कुछ ऐसे चीज़ें लिखने पड़ते ही है. आई थिंक दीज आर इनएविटेबल एंड शुड नॉट बी लुक्ड एट एज अ very wrong thing that Savarkar did. Only in an ideal, abstract, enlightened world can these things not be done. In effect, through Savarkar's deliberate delineation of each occurrence of the word Hindu, he makes a new kind of historical argument by repetition and accretion, the mere listing of mythological names sufficing as proof. Savarkar understood that nationalism does not in fact need historical accuracy. In his indifference to all the protocols of historical writing that Rajwade embraced, he seems to suggest that myth provides a more than adequate substitute for history. Savarkar uses a smattering of quotes from early chronicles and contemporaneous historical evidence, such as letters in the service of a single point of convergence, which is Shivaji's defeat of Aurangzeb. The first work Savarkar quotes from is Prithviraj Raso by Chand Bardai. Since Chand Bardai uses the words Hindi and Hind and so often as far back as the 11th century, Savarkar argues that there can be no doubt on the matter that Hindu was a term used as a self-identifying definition. Yet again, Savarkar shows the irrelevance of historical accuracy, since Prithviraj Raso dates no earlier than the 16th century. From Chand Bardai, Savarkar leaps to Guru Ramdas and quotes numerous lines from a poem that dreams of a world in which the righteous reign and Aurangzeb is defeated by Shivaji. In which the righteous people reign and Aurangzeb is defeated by Shivaji. The Hindu poet Bhushan, who challenges Aurangzeb and praises Shivaji, is cited only as Vide Bhushan Granthawali. 3 undetailed citations follow. Chatra Prakash with the explanation that it was the text that described the events of Chhatrasal's reign, for which no dates are given, and was composed by Lal Kavi, followed by Patha Prakash and then Surya Prakash, absent the names of authors, let alone the dates of publication. In this section, a youthful Shivaji wrote a letter in 1646, and the source is identified as Rajwade's collection. Okay, I don't know how a book called Essentials of Hindutva should be looked upon as a historical or a scholarly work of history. In the last part of this section, Savarkar uses letters again, but we are given no further information about where to locate them. Dhondo Govind to Bajirao, Bajirao to Brahmendra Swami, Jai Singh, where we are given a detailed date. That is AD October 26, 1721, but no location. Nana Sahib's letters, and the last letter from Govind Rao Kale to Nana Fadnavis in 1793. Why are there so few specifics? When I asked this question of Savarkar's physician, Arvind Godbole, who attended to him in his last years and is himself the author of a book and several articles on Savarkar, I found him both bemused and matter-of-fact in his response. According to him, Savarkar had an exceptional and photographic memory, and he had read Gurmukhi texts as a student in London when he wrote a history of the Sikh community. Prithviraj Raso was a text he read in the Andamans. Furthermore, Savarkar had been independently mulling over the idea of quote-unquote Hindutva while a student in London, and had written part of a territorial poem, Priyakar Hindustan, in which he had already done the conceptual work for Hindutva. Okay, so much earlier, guys. In any event, Hindutva was written in prison and in secret. He had a plan and he had followed it exactly. तो वहाँ पे जेल में बैठ के citation कहाँ से लाएगा हर book का? The text itself makes clear, however, that there was no need for more evidence or exactitude. Savarkar's shrewd political sense lay in accurately identifying his middle-class audience, one that he could captivate by his mixture of an older poetic modality in English prose, and then impress with his seeming grasp of an array of historical sources in several languages. He was not writing for the scholarly elite, exactly what I'm saying, many of whom could challenge his Sanskrit knowledge, or his translation of texts, or even his pretensions to poetic convention, kavya. He was not writing for the Sanskrit Pandits in Pune or Varanasi, who might well have been familiar with the Bhavishya Purana. He was not writing for the philologists,
who might have contested his dizzying and idiosyncratic run through history, ticking off instances of the word Hindu. Savarkar inaugurates a populist anti-intellectualism at the time that he attempts to show that whatever intellectuals could do, he could do better. Liberal sprinklings of Sanskrit phrases and couplets help alleviate and assuage any anxiety about the authority of the text. Given Savarkar's obvious education, erudition, and intellectual ability, the historical section was no aberration. His use of a small selection of Sanskrit okay, interesting, very important thing. If any scholar is hearing this, remember to cite this in your research that this mainstream legit scholar says that at least admits to Savarkar's obvious education, erudition, and intellectual ability. His use of a small selection of Sanskrit quotations was meant to demonstrate to a bourgeois Hindu population holding any number of romantic notions about Sanskrit that he was a learned scholar. Okay? कोई भी अगर उसको आके बोलना चाहे कि तुमको तो संस्कृत नहीं आता है, तुम उतने बड़े पढ़े लिखे नहीं हो, सावरकर उसका बात नहीं सुनेगा. That was Savarkar's intention with this work. Other than, among other things, of course. It did not matter whether his Sanskrit quotations were inaccurate or taken out of context, or even if his transliterations of Sanskrit were sufficient to satisfy academic philologists. His aim was to produce awe and thus authority in the reader's imagination. After all, how could someone who could produce from memory 20 Sanskrit quotations, verses from Prithviraj Raso, read while in the Andamans, verses from Gurmukhi texts read while in London, Prithviraj Raso read while in the Andamans, selections from the Bhavishya Purana, and remember the collection of letters in Rajwade's possession about Maratha history, and Taraknath Vachaspati writing in Bengal, writing all the while in prison, be anything other than extraordinary. Wherever Savarkar recognizes a scholarly question, or this is actually good scholarship, you know. This is almost neutral, except the unfair use of the word prejudice 50 times. Because I'm saying that because this can easily be looked upon as a defense of Savarkar or as a criticism of Savarkar, depending on what are your personal views. But she has not tried to force you into believing or looking at Savarkar in any specific way. I think I agree with most of what she's saying about Savarkar or this work in particular. Wherever Savarkar recognizes a scholarly question or the possibility that some readers might demand greater historical detail, he uses the standard disclaimer that these details are hardly germane to his project. Yeah, it's not even necessary to the project. While implying at the same time his complete command of the material. Acha. Yeah, ye to criticism hai. For instance, when Savarkar I don't know how to pronounce this, excoriates. For instance, when Savarkar excoriates Buddhism for its political, not religious practices, he writes that dark hints abound in our ancient records to show that at times some foreign Buddhist powers had actually invaded India with an express national and religious aim in view. As evidence, he cites an episode from the Bhavishya Purana. Savarkar came from a generation of late 19th, early 20th century Indian intellectuals whose education allowed them to become equally fluent in English and Sanskrit. But being able to translate and compose in Sanskrit is not the same as having critical knowledge of Sanskrit scholarship. Yeah, Sanskritist hona to ek alag baat hai. Savarkar had read Rajwade without a doubt, but his learning was not the same. Nonetheless, he used Sanskrit to claim a reputation as a Hindu scholar who could use the wealth of ancient learning as the basis of his vision for the future of India. For these reasons, Hindutva cannot simply be viewed as an angry tract, or for that matter as a casual intervention into the political fray. Nor was it